to try to do a video about why ghosts might exist. It's kind of a complicated topic, but I just did a video about the double slit experiment. I also talked about how our thoughts and how our intentions affect the world around us. It kind of gets into quantum physics a little bit, but quantum physics is a very complicated topic. I think I understand it fairly decently, so I want to try to simplify quantum physics and do a video and try to make quantum physics a lot more easy for other people to understand. So I understand that a lot of people don't believe in ghosts. There's a lot of unexplained things that have been going on in this world. In the last video I talked about how our vision is a very limited range, how our hearing, because we're human, is a very limited range. So there's lots of noise outside of our range that we can't hear. There's lots of visual range outside of what our eyes can actually see. Ghosts would fall into the category of things that exist, but things that we can't see because it's out of our vibrational range of what our eyes can actually perceive. From my understanding of quantum physics, we talked about how the double slit experiment basically proves that there is a aspect of atoms and molecules that we actually can't study and can't see. When a particle exists and it isn't being viewed, it acts like water. So it flows in waves. So basically that means it's a probability scale for each particle. Everyone has learned in school about bell curves and how bell curves work. Basically, you can think of each particle as having a bell curve of possibilities. Within that bell curve for that particular particle, you can look at any particular point to see if it's in that spot. It will actually collapse onto one possibility when you look at it. That's why when you're not viewing them, they're technically in all aspects. I mean, it's literally hitting every inch of the plate that's blocking it. At the same time, it's going through both holes. So in essence, because it's existing within that experiment simultaneously, it creates the interference pattern, because when one particle goes through one slit, that same particle goes through the other slit. So when they both meet on the back end of the plate, they interfere with each other, which is why they act like water. I showed how water goes through two slits, and because water literally exists in both holes, it exists behind the holes, it exists in front of the holes. When you create one wave and the wave goes up and hits the plate, it radiates through both holes as if both holes are separate. So then as both probabilities go through both holes, the water interferes with itself, and that's what creates the interference pattern in the double slit experiment. When you think of particles as water, that's the easiest way to understand that they are simultaneously existing in all possibilities at the same time. But once we break it down and look at that particular particle, so when we watch which hole it's going to go through, it realizes it's being watched, so it breaks down to one probability or the other. And as I explained, there's three possibilities. One is hitting the plate, one's going through the left hole, and one's going through the right hole. This is the only way that we can experience these particles and their wave function, because as soon as you go inside of their probability curve and you test them, like we said, they break down to one probability. So the bell curve is no longer a bell curve, it now breaks down to one choice within that variation of probabilities. The reason that this is important to talking about ghosts is because in quantum physics there's a theory that says since a particle has a bell curve of possibilities, that means not only one of the possibilities is existing, all the possibilities are existing. And that's where quantum physics comes up with the multiverse understanding of the world, meaning that if one universe exists, because that universe is inside of a probability curve or a bell curve for that universe, then that means all the other possibilities need to also exist inside of that bell curve, because there's a saying, as above so below. Basically what that means is when you have a probability curve on the tiny scale of particles, that probability curve is going to carry up to the massive. It's also going to continue carrying down to things that are smaller than particles. That's why the idea of as above so below is so important, because you can almost think of our solar system as if it was, so our particular solar system has a certain amount of planets revolving around it, just like each single individual atom that exists. What makes an aluminum atom aluminum is how many particles it has spinning around the nucleus. So that's pretty much what determines the difference between one atom and the other atom. So since every solar system in our galaxy is a completely different entity, you can literally think of each solar system as a slightly different atom. So that means the energy inside of each solar system, since they all have different amounts of planets spinning around them, the planets are spinning at different degrees in comparison to the nucleus, hence the sun that's in the middle of them. So that's why every solar system has its own energy, because every solar system is completely different. So you can think of each solar system as being a completely different molecule inside of the massive major expanse of our universe. And the reason this is important is because when they do scans of our brain and they show all the neurons and the electrical and chemical impulses through the neurons, and when they map that out in our brain, they've done the same mapping of the entire universe, and they find out that the universe we live in looks like scans of our brain. So it's almost like our universe is a brain by itself and we're living inside of that brain. So that kind of makes you wonder, like, what universes can be living inside of our brains that are smaller than us that we are unaware of because they're so small. Now, there's no way for us to gauge them. But anyways, with that being said, religion and spiritual teachers, they talk about free will. Now, there's always been an argument between whether things are predetermined when you come into this life, or whether you actually have free will. So people have been debating between the two, but science is now proving that they both can simultaneously exist. And I'm going to explain right now how they both do simultaneously exist. So I talked about how everything's basically a frequency. When we taste with our tongue, we're basically tasting chemicals that are in the foods that we're eating, but each chemical would have a different frequency to it. So just like an aluminum atom or a gold atom, each has a different frequency. Each individual particle in your food that you eat has a different frequency as well. So it's not like we're tasting chemicals per se when we eat something. It's more like we're tasting the frequency of it, because everybody knows that when we hear things, the reason we hear is because of frequency. When we're looking at stuff, we can see things and we see different colors because of the frequency that it's at. Now, I'm sure everybody has seen a color palette on your computer. The color palettes used to be mixed up where they basically look like the rainbow. So you go from a color scheme of the furthest colors on the left to the furthest colors on the right. So then in between each color, which are your basic colors like Roy G. Biv, right? Those are the basic colors that we all know about, but each color blends in between. So you get a whole bunch of different shades of all of those colors in the rainbow. So everyone's seen those color palettes, but they've made the color palettes a lot more complicated now on the computers. So now instead of just going from left to right to get colors, now you can go from top to bottom to get different colors as well. A larger 2D model of the color scheme is what our computers use. The reason that this is so important to this discussion is because each color is literally a different frequency of the visual spectrum. So if you think of your hearing as being a frequency, when you're playing music, there's different frequencies to the sound. You can get a similar frequency, which is the same note being played, but it's an octave higher or an octave lower, so it sounds a little bit different even though it vibrates in a similar fashion. So that's how we currently get our music. Just how each piano has a different key that when you push it, it plays a slightly different sound, and then you can go up in octaves and you can go down in octaves, which also explains the saying as above so below, because when you get to an octave above and you still play an A, the A has a similar vibration, but the frequency is different because you're an octave above or an octave below that note. When you talk about quantum physics and you talk about different frequencies in music and different frequencies in the visual spectrum, you can think of the multiple universes being the same. So basically, a multiple universe would be like the book of paper. So on one page and on one side of the sheet you have one universe, and then on the back side of the sheet you have another universe, and then you have a whole bunch of different pages of the universes. So it's almost like this side of this page is one frequency, but then this side of that page is a different frequency. So they're close frequencies, but there's just enough difference between the frequencies that they're connected, but they're not really connected. And then the further you get away from that sheet, so the further you get down here into the booklet, the further you got away from the original frequency. So this might be the frequency that you're living on right now, and then this might be a frequency that you're living on 10 years ago. Because every single time you come into a choice in your life, every single time that you were given a choice, if you chose choice A, you might stay on this side of the sheet. If you choose choice B, you might end up going to this side of the sheet. So it's close and it's overlapping, but it's a slightly different frequency. And I mean, as your choices change, or as you made a different choice, you get further and further away from where the original choice happened. So it's almost like through your life you're jumping through the pages, but these pages are pretty much infinite. There's possibly no end. Like, I mean, it's almost like this book is a bell curve for you, just like a particle has a bell curve of existences that it could exist in, and when you look at one specific instance of the particle, you find it in a specific spot. So the bell curve gets collapsed to one outcome, whereas when you're not looking, there is a whole bunch of outcomes. So it's almost like this book is your life, and it's a bell curve of the different lives that you could have. So I mean, all of these pages exist right now, and they've always have existed, and they always will exist. But the difference is which page are you going to end up on? Well, each page that you end up on is a variation of the choices you've made up until this time. So yes, you do have free will, but yes, everything has been predetermined. So even though you're living in a bell curve, I mean, not every possibility is possible for you in your life, but most possibilities for you in your life are possible. That's why it's a bell curve. So in the middle of the bell curve is the most likely types of lives that you're going to exist in, and that gives you the most possibilities which is why the bell curve is peaked at that point, because that's the most likely lives that you're ever going to have based on the choices that you make. But then when you get down to the very outskirts of that bell curve, those are the probabilities for you, but they're the least likely spot that you're going to ever exist in. So it's almost like your consciousness that's living in your body right now has looked at a certain point of that bell curve. All the lives have collapsed onto that one particular point of all the possible existences. So the reason that this is important to understand ghosts is because if you're living on this page and let's say you die, just because you died on this page doesn't mean that you died on this side of the page or on this page or on the next page. So because you passed away here, you could still be existing in all these other places. You could be living in the same house on the first 5 sheets. So let's say you don't get into a different house until you're 6 sheets away, and then now you're living in a different house. Well, what happens is, since each one of these pages has a different vibration, it's not like the vibration is completely consistent. So when you push the key on a piano, the key hits the string, so the string vibrates, but the string changes its vibration. So it'll vibrate at a certain consistency, but sometimes the vibration over time will slowly wane out till you can't hear that vibration anymore. With all these things vibrating, sometimes these sheets could get so close together that even though you're passed away in this reality, that this reality where you're alive might get close enough to this reality that someone might experience you somewhere in this reality, but what they're actually experiencing isn't the shadow of you. It's not the person that you were. It's the person that maybe you are on this side of the sheet. So maybe it's that the vibration of both realities got so close that you actually show up so someone can see you in a reality where you're not actually existing anymore. So that could be a possibility of why we encounter ghosts. Like, let's say there's a hospital in one reality, and in our reality the hospital's abandoned. Well, in that reality the hospital might not have ever been abandoned. It still might be in use. So when you go into that old abandoned hospital, to you it looks like it's been abandoned for a long time. It is decrepit, but in the other reality it is like brand new. So you could be experiencing entities from that other reality, and maybe the vibration just got close enough that you're experiencing it. Now, some people say that they've been able to take ghostly encounters and they've been able to kind of pinpoint it down to one particular person that existed in the past. But I mean, since all these pages are existing simultaneously, and the only point on which page that you are going to be on at any given time is based on the choices in the past, because all these sheets are existing. So let's say this is your past on this page and this is your future on this page. So somewhere in between there is where you're existing. But if you make a different choice at one point, you can switch and basically go through the page to the next page. But then you'll be given a choice here, and you might go back to this page, or based on that choice you might end up on the next page. So because all these pages are existing simultaneously, there's nothing saying that this corner of this page might not come over and touch the corner of this page. And if that's the case, then that means that someone that was existing in the past before you were even born, somehow, because this page would be infinitely long either way, as well as infinitely deep either way. So it doesn't mean that this page can't come over here and then now you're experiencing someone who existed in the past because the page somehow bends over. So string theory talks about how every particle is made up of a whole bunch of different strings, and these strings vibrate at different wavelengths. If that's true, then each string vibrating at a different wavelength, if that string starts vibrating a little differently than what it was vibrating. It could, in essence, because of the change of vibration, it could bring something from the past into the future, or vice versa, something from the future into the past. But since we live on a very linear time view in this 3D dimension, we don't actually think we go back in time. But I mean, if each one of these is a different dimension, you're literally a dimensional traveler, because you're traveling through dimensions as you travel through all of these pages. If you're in the middle of these pages, you can more easily gravitate to this side of the book or this side of the book than what you can gravitate to this side of the book if you're here. If you're on the first page, you can't very easily get all the way to the last page. But if you're in between the book, it's more likely you're going to get to the first sheet or the last sheet because you're closer. I'm not saying that ghosts are real or they're not real. I mean, people say that they're able to take scientific instruments and they're able to measure ghostly encounters, and they're saying that they can prove that ghosts do exist.